and share my screen for Janusz to introduce today's topic. Okay. Everybody can see the slides? Okay.
See it. Okay, so welcome to the N3C Community Forum for July 10th, 2023. Next slide. Okay, so again, some general things. This presentation will be recorded and will be archived in the CD2H YouTube channel. And since we're, please use the Q&A button to post your questions when we have the question time, and then use the raise hand feature for the host to unmute your microphone. So there's some updates that we want to report on, and this is a lot of work that the publication committee's been working on. And there's been an update to the N3C publication intent form via the N3 Enclave is now available. So now there's a slightly new form to work through. And you see a link below. And there's been a presentation of the new form, which you can watch on YouTube, and then a N3C publication committee and policies, also YouTube video to watch. So this should, you know, we've been working on this for a while, and this should help streamline the process of getting all that great research out for publication. So updates. So for the month of August, the N3C Community Forum will be on break. And then you know, after Labor Day, we're going to be resume in September with some additional great talks. Yeah, so key figures. Actually, I just looked at this just before, and I think we can update, just breaking news, I guess, right? That we're now at site 80 sites, which is you know, we keep growing. So that number just happened. So 80 sites, and we have again, you know, a large number of the 20 million individuals, 7.8 million COVID positive cases, large number of different rows from clinical observations to lab results to medication records to procedures and visits. And many people are working on some really interesting research to find insight from this data. So on the next community forum on July 24th, we're going to have Dr. Wilkins give a presentation on evaluating a research study design analysis plan in light of best practices for real world research data. So again, you know, we have this large amount of data, and we're working in this EHR data environment, and it will provide some insight in sort of how do you design and evaluate your studies to find meaningful conclusions from large scale EHR data. Okay, so today we have, you can see some of our panelists here already. We're going to be talking about the N3C Tenant Pilot, which is some exciting work that's been going on. That's, you know, to sort of extend the N3C to additional clinical conditions. So I think we have some great presenters here, so I'm going to pass it off, I guess, to Ken first. To go forward.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Janusz. And Teresa, you're going to bring up the slides. Thank you.
Oh, you would like me to bring up the slides?
Yeah,
Yes.
Yeah, that would be great. Or
just one second. Assuming the slides that Sad shared in Slack a couple of days ago.
if not, I can bring it up.
Just one moment. I don't want to take up too much time. If that's okay, would you share
Yeah,
your
absolutely.
screen? I'm not able to find the slides right now.
No problem. Now you guys got to just tell me how to put it in slide share mode.
There's a button at the top right that's a slideshow.
There,
Keep going. A little to
or
the
share.
oh nope, slideshow right before that. Right before that, sorry. Yep. You keep passing it. Slide next to it. Right to the right of it is a slideshow button.
Oh, right here.
Yeah.
All right. See if I did that right.
Not quite. If you want to close out the, sorry. Would you like to paste that link to the chat and then I can share my screen?
I can share it if you want, Ken. Give me 1 second.
Here, I think I can see it now.
Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. All right, next slide, please. Next slide. Here we go. I was asked to, first of all, thanks for inviting me. It's always exciting. Despite the fact that I've talked on the forum so many times, I always get a little nervous because I think this is so important. But anyway, I was asked to talk today about the tenant and what that is and why we're doing it. And so I thought I'd go through some of the things that we are doing in the tenant, and but also kind of set the stage and how this more of the background, how this fits into our overall kind of data planning strategy. At the very surface of it, this slide is just trying to show is that we really want to move forward with all the work we've done, which I'm going to go over in a second, that we did for COVID, N3C COVID, and apply it or leverage it for diseases beyond COVID. And you all probably know this is that really N3C was started well before COVID. Not only was there CD2H, but there was also the work that NCATS had done. And so really in some ways now that COVID is less of a firestorm, we're kind of returning back to where we were started at the very beginning. So next slide. So just a reminder is that really, and I'm going to, Sam Michael is really the architect of this, who is CIO at NCATS. But really what the step back is that, you know, the CTSA and CTRs are, you know, it's 60 plus, depending on how many any folks are funded, large academic and then of course part of N3C COVID, we have community and ocean institutions that are sharing data. And so Sam, many years ago, and we realized we really couldn't continue to have duplicative services, started to set up what he refers to as a virtual research network, which is actually what N3C exists in. And as a virtual network, it's more than just Palantir, though that's obviously core to it. But there's, you know, the single sign-on is FedRAMP moderate. People have use of Slack and Google Workspace and Jira and all of these things. The whole idea was to set this up as a secure, safe place where we could really promote good science, but also good team science. Next slide. And, you know, through N3C, we, you know, as Yanis was saying a second ago, we have 80 institutions now who have given us data contributors, but, you know, there's 360, well, I think it's 326 exactly, institutions that are using the data and over 3,500 investigators. So I bring this up, the DTA, DUA, and the third agreement, which is the sharing agreement, the linkage agreement, is because the model for the tenant is to leverage that governance and come up with that master agreement that instead of just COVID specific, removes COVID, but allows us to do almost the exact same thing, but in other illnesses. And so I'm sure the governance will change, but that is what we're leveraging for this next step. Next slide. And the other things we're leveraging, and I'll go through these quickly, is I think you all probably know this, that there are at least 100 transformations for every site that we get. And this is just a picture of one site. And this transformation, we don't want to do this again. And there's no reason to. So this is one of the things we really put a lot of effort into. Next slide. And you guys know that we're going to leverage things like data quality and unit harmonization. Next slide. And the other things that I'm not sure everybody's aware, but I hope they are, is that, you know, part of Recover, we were able to add 6 domains of social determinants of health, and that joined the ability, because we work with American AIA and American Indian American Native community, and through a tribal consultation, where we have well over 100,000 AIA and people in the enclave, which you search. And then there's also, I think, 60 or so public available data sets. And I put example of social deprivation of index. So well, those will come with the tenant also. Next slide. But, you know, one of the other things we want to talk about or make sure that we're bringing forward is that real world data, as, you know, Mike Carrillo often refers to it as messy, and I always think how nice he is using the term messy. It's beyond messy. It's darn right dirty. And it is absolutely required, I believe, for real world data. But the goal of N3C was not just clinical data. It was to glue many different types of data together. And it's not that we want to control all data or create the large data palace in the sky. In fact, just the opposite. But we think or felt that in order to get a good view of that person, just having their EHR data was really not a very good view. It's when the person comes in who's sick, right? So we needed to add viral variants and mortality. And we have MIDRIC images in which I'm hoping will be made available, working with registry data, specifically the SEER cancer data registry, and bringing those in. And we feel, and of course, a CMS data, which was and national mortality, and all of this is all linked. And we think that this has to be moved forward into the next one. Next slide, please. Some things you're not aware of is that, you know, when we implemented pprl, we did a tremendous amount of work, we being Sean Granis and Reagan Stripe and Datavon, on validating on pprl, because even though this is behind the scenes, if you don't believe that we're doing a good job of matching, you wouldn't trust it. And it's not like if this is more kind of the what's happening behind the scenes, or, you know, in the kitchen, so to speak. But one of the things we were lucky with is that Regan Stripe, which is our honest broker, is part of the Indiana HIE, and they were able to use the ability to identify data in Indiana with their N3C data and do the validation, not only with pprl for mortality, but in this case for CMS. Next slide. So a couple of seconds ago, I talked about, I used a term, it's actually Melissa's term, I stole from her, data palace. I think that N3C is a data palace, and I would say to some degree, that's the wrong direction. And it's not the direction we wanted to go. It was the direction we had to go in the crush of the pandemic. But if you look at this slide, the data on the bottom right is our data palace. That's what's in N3C. But I don't know if you all also know that we actually are actively linking to other enclaves outside of NCATS and outside of the sets we purchase, all of us, and MIDRIC and NHLBI. And so we think that the future of real world data is not for any group to be that data palace, but to be able to link that data across enclaves and make that available. Next slide. And so the future of of real world data, and I would say what we're trying to do looks much more like this, where there's the honest broker and all of these different data contributors, whether it's EHR data or CMS data or cancer registry data. The number one is saying that, let's say that there's a terrible crisis and we need to combine FDA data and CMS data. Well, CMS and FDA would say, are there any people that are in both? That's number one. Number two, do these people have permission to see both? Number three, let's put all our data transfer it to a secure, independent, shared governance space, and we will work in this ephemeral workspace called the Freeport. And so this is really kind of an amazing thing. We're saying that at that moment in time, when CMS and FDA are working, they jointly own the data in this temporary workspace and control it. And that governance that we worked on in N3C, this will allow them to share in just the same master agreement. Because if we don't do this, we'll never be able to actually quickly respond to a terrible tragedy like COVID, because it's our inability to share which causes us so much problem. So this is where we think it's going to look like in the future, and certainly what we're moving towards. Next slide. So that Freeport, we were lucky enough to be given funding to test this. And I won't go into details of this slide, but there's two big pieces of this: a data sharing, modifying the DTA DUA linkage on broker agreement, and the technical side, which is really making sure that John Doe has access to not only, let's say, their institution's data, but also CMS data or also FDA. So there's this privacy authorization aspect to it to make sure that everybody's comfortable. Next slide, please. So switching gears, one thing that N3C did, which was really a lot of work, and obviously Johns Hopkins, Chris Shute, and their amazing team did, of harmonizing many common data models. But through TEFCA and ONC, FHIR is going to become the lingua franca. But FHIR is not an analytic model; it is a transport model. And so the advantage of using FHIR is wonderful. You get much more data. It's like drinking from a fire hose as opposed to a straw. But that data still has to be harmonized and placed in an analytic repository. Right now, we're using OMOP. But in the future, we want to be able to put it in any analytic enclave. Next slide. So again, we were given funding, and we're working on this right now, and I'm hoping we're going to be showing a demo of this in the next 60 or so days, where you actually can bring your data into what we call Codemap services and say, I have a CoreNet and I want to change it to OMOP. And you can just take that home with you. You don't need to be in N3C. There's a separate service. But the other thing you could do, next slide, is if you were working and you had your data in a FHIR model, and then you were working on it in OMOP, but you needed to submit it to the FDA, you could actually convert it to CDIS SDTM, because the FDA only takes one format. So the way we've done this is that FHIR is the canonical hub, but it actually can be turned into any data. And the nice thing about what we're doing is this data is stored in a metadata repository at Cancer Institute, and I won't go into it, but really it ends up being the source of truth, and we can go into that in many details later. But it's an incredibly powerful resource that is where we're seeing that this is where the mapping will live and continue to be modernized and updated. Next slide. So, oh my gosh, I finally get to the tenant. So this is the tenant as we're why we think this is important, and each one of these things I talked about, we're taking a few steps, baby steps in moving towards this world of interoperability, which we think is the future. And I just want to explain some of the new things that are part of the tenant, besides us learning the cost and how it is to do it, and we needed to modify their governance. There's something really quite powerful about this. And in this cartoon, there's 3 institutions, just I'll pretend, UNC, Johns Hopkins, Nebraska. And they give N3C all of their data. I can't emphasize this enough. The transfer of data is their entire EHR. It's a phenotype, and it's only taking worthwhile, I'll say, visits, but in essence, it's the whole thing. And that's then goes into the center box where you see the 3 databases. In that center box, their entire research data is harmonized and cleaned, and nobody has access to it but the institution that gave their data. So UNC only is the group that has access to UNC data. And the blue arrows are 2-headed. It goes both ways, meaning they can pull their data back. So not only have we harmonized it, but we've harmonized it so they could collaborate with another institution that they used our services for harmonization. We don't have to be involved in it all, but their data now is cleaned and matched. And that's a really nice service. But then what, for me, the magic is this next step, where you see it says with a little hourglass, it says phenotype pulmonary and phenotype renal. And if, let's say, UNC and Johns Hopkins decide they want to work on pulmonary research, we'll call the pulmonary tenant, then a query is written that pulls that data into Johns Hopkins and UNC's private space, not all of the data, just the phenotype. And here's where it's so important what we've done. The IRB at NIH says, because you have handled the data in the middle column well, and it's de-identified and safe and HIPAA compliant, common rule compliant, we don't need another proposal, another IRB approval, because you are bringing this de-identified into a de-identified subset tenant. And that means that within hours, if we had a phenotype, we could pull the data of any type into a new space. And think about how powerful that is. We're not going back to the sites. We're not having to clean it because it's already been pre-cleaned. We're just pulling it in and giving people permission. The other thing about the tenant that's really important is the bottom one, where it's showing renal CU Colorado is not actually, wants to be part of the renal tenant, but they're not contributing data. Well, in the tenant model, the other thing is the concept of agency. So in this case, Johns Hopkins in Nebraska had created the tenant, and CU said, hey, would you let me in? And they asked really nicely, and they get to choose if they get added or not. So unlike N3C, where all data was open for all people, this is a controlled space, because we're trying to encourage people to contribute data and use the data, but there is the ability to also allow people to come in who don't have data. But you, as the site owners, the data contributors, get to make that control. And that's kind of the innovation, so to speak, in the tenant. Next slide. Oh, thank goodness. So I'm finished. I'm going to introduce you to Maya. I hope you all have met Maya before. She works at Palantir, and take it away, Maya.
Amazing. Yeah. So thank you for all of that introduction, Ken. I just wanted to highlight a few more of the pieces in this tenant pilot piece. And then Saad is going to pass it over and actually give some instructions on kind of where you get started and where resources can be found. So I've been involved in a lot of the technical setup and implementation in the tenant. And here are some kind of key summary statistics and metrics that are helpful to know. The first piece is that 6 sites have submitted data already, but we're expecting ultimately 10 sites to be part of the pilot. As Ken mentioned, sites submit a much larger phenotype than they do for N3C. So this is a much larger payload that they're submitting. And in each tenant, sites can choose to opt in or opt out. So as in that previous slide, for example, Duke can choose to opt into one of the tenants, but not the other. And this really kind of emphasizes governance. It allows every site to decide how their data can be used. Going to the next slide. The current tenants that we have. So again, sites submit a much larger phenotype and a much larger payload, but then for each tenant, we have a further phenotype that gets extracted. And so currently in the enclave, we have an Alzheimer's tenant, a renal tenant, and a pulmonary tenant. And we're expecting that a cancer tenant might come later in fall of 2023. Next slide. So these are some basic patient counts. These are actually out of date. They will be updated probably a bit later today to be even larger. But at the current moment, the renal phenotype is the largest, so it has the largest patient count. But as you can see, the Alzheimer's and pulmonary tenants also have quite a few patients. And one more piece of information here is that for this pilot, all data is level 2, so it does not require an IRB when submitting a data use request. And with that, I believe I'm handing it over to Saad to, oh, actually, I have one more slide. Yep. One more piece here to highlight is the data quality. So similarly to N3C, we've been able to reuse a lot of these pieces. We are still unit harmonizing to improve the metrics that sites are submitting to us. We're tracking data quality and working with sites to improve where needed. And as Ken alluded to, sites will have a space where they can get access to their cleaned OMOP data. So that will be only, the site can access only their data, but they will be able to basically get access to their clean OMOP data, which is another thing they get by submitting to this. And now with that, I will hand it over to Saad to give some more details on where things can be accessed.
Thank you, Maya. Let me switch to a view of the platform. Second. Oops. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is just some of the mechanics of accessing this tenant data and using it as part of your research if you're interested in doing research in one of the 3 established tenants. And I'll show some examples of importing data sets and getting started with your research. So this is the N3C homepage. Some of you may be familiar with it. What's new here is that we added an additional link currently called N3 Clinical Homepage, which is just a link that takes you to the relevant resources for these 3 tenants. And so if you click on it, you'll go to this alternative homepage that is specific to the research tenants that have been established. And so if you, there are 2 things that are important to mention here. First, if you need to, if you would like to get access to one of the 3 tenants, you need to submit a data use request. And so you do that by going to this dashboard, Explore N3 Clinical Project. And so as Maya and Ken mentioned, currently there are 3 established tenants, and there will likely be more in the future. So there's the Alzheimer's disease research tenant, pulmonary research tenant, and renal disease. And so requesting access is as simple as clicking on request to join here and then submitting this data use request. This, because it's level 2, the identified data security tier, you won't need to submit an IRB. But so you fill in this form and then you submit a data use request, you receive a confirmation email, and then when it gets approved by when you get the approval, you get a notification that your workspace is created and ready, and you can start research. One thing important to note here is that in most cases, for you to be able to submit a DUR for one of these 3 tenants, you need to be part of the one of the 10 institutions that are contributing data. However, if you are not and you would still like to request access, you can. The form will tell you once you fill it, but you can email NCATS and explain the rationale and request access.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
I wanted to interrupt you.
Right.
I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just wanted to point out one important difference here in the tenant is that the tenants are the DURs are pre-configured. So when you come in, and that's how tenants will work, right? Because it's going to have to be approved by the CTSA community, the CDR community, which ones are funded. So unlike the DUR where you say, I want to do something, you're joining, in this case, in the tenant, one of those 3 ones to choose from. So In that way, it's very different. Sorry, Saad, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, no
Very
problem, Ken. So going back to the homepage that I was showing here, once you get your DUR approved, you'll join an existing workspace, or you will have a new workspace for you created. And the way to access that is going through this My Project workspaces. And so if you are also having, if you're part of other research projects in N3C, the COVID tenant, you'll see this will show you a list of all the research projects that you are part of. And in my case, I'm not part of any research projects, and with the admin's configuration, I can see the existing ones, but in your case, you'll be able to see your research project. It starts with RP and a number, and you'll be able to, and that's where you can do your work and import data sets. And so to show you an example, I'm going to go to this example research project. And so suppose this is the workspace that have been created for you once your DUR is approved. This is where you can do work and import data sets from the tenant and analyze them and create results from this workspace. So I just created a project folder here just to show you a couple examples on how to download the data. So once you're on your research project, you can use various analysis tools. And I'll show you an example with Code Workbook, and then I'll switch to another one with Jupyter Notebook. So the way you import data sets is by creating an analysis. And again, like I said, you can use Code Workbook, you can use some no-code tools such as Contour, or you can use code repositories. There are other trainings about, there are trainings in the training portal about all these various tools. And so the starting point once you create an analysis is to import a data set that you want to analyze. And in this case, since we're talking about the tenants, and once you get access, you go to the data catalog. And if you've been approved to the Alzheimer's tenant, you'll be able to find the data sets in this Alzheimer de-identified data. All the data sets are in the OMAP common data model. So you'll be able to import the person table or the condition table or all the tables that are specific to this tenant and in the OMAP format. And similarly, this is where you find the data for the pulmonary tenant and the renal tenants. They're all in the OMAP format. So you will see the prefix of the tenant name. So in this case, renal, and then the name of the OMAP table, person, measurements, etc. I won't import the data sets here because this is real data, but I just wanted to show you the mechanics of how to import it in your analysis. Similarly, and like Ken mentioned, you can import these tenant data, but you also still have access to all the resources that have been developed in N3C. For example, in the Knowledge Store, you can import all the templates that have been developed, and you can import all the external open source data sets, such as the data sets that are coming from the census. So I can show you an example in here, and then I'll pass it off to, and then I'll be done with my demo. So suppose you created a Jupyter notebook or Jupyter Lab workspace in your research project. You can go here and click on Add Dataset, and then go to Import Your Data. And then instead of, maybe I'll do it slightly differently. Let me just open the Knowledge Store to show you where to find these resources that you can import. So if you go to the N3C homepage, by the way, the Knowledge Store is also accessible from the tenant homepage. But if you go to the Knowledge Store, all the code templates that are available here that have been developed as part of N3C can be imported in your workspace, and you can use them and run them on your data sets. But also, if you click on external data sets, you'll be able to import open source data that have been ingested into the platform. So for example, let's say you want to import the Sourceful Vulnerability Index, which is a data set coming from the census, US Census. you can look here at the shared data sets and then just copy the path. And then if you go back to the Jupyter notebook, you can just pass this path and then import the data sets in your Jupyter lab and then start the analysis on it. So this is just another example of how to get started once you get your workspace created and you have access to all these resources. I think that's mostly what I wanted to show in this workspace. You just have links to the resources that are already available in N3C. And so you have the data catalog, the knowledge store, concept set browser, links to submit your download requests. And then if you want to go back to the main N3C homepage and do research on the COVID tenants, you also have the link for that. So I think that's mostly what I wanted to show, and I think I will pass it off to Melissa.
And thank you, Saad, for that, showing us the new homepage. So as if the tenant scales past the pilot, we're really excited about the new UI. Thank you. Looks great.
Yeah, it's super exciting. Thanks to you all for so much hard work. Hopefully everyone realizes how much work has gone into making this come to fruition. And so I don't have a whole lot to report here, but I really just wanted to kind of give you a prelude to what's coming. And when we next meet, we'll give an update. So if you can go to the next slide, please. So I just wanted to kind of speak a little bit about kind of some of the lessons learned in the N3C and, you know, how we're kind of using those in the pilot and really to invite everyone to participate. So the first thing, and you've heard me on the soapbox before, is just that governance is a team sport. And I think that, you know, some of the great success that we had in N3C was due in part to, you know, a philosophy of shared governance that was shared between the community members that were using the data, the institutions and their representatives that were submitting the data, the NIH and all of the various flavors of stewardship that had to happen there, the IRB, you know, the tribal council, Ken and his leadership of the clinical informatics team, you know, Chris and now Joni's support. And really sort of by building this pilot based upon some of those lessons learned, but really learning from those experiences in thinking through how do we actually scale this to all disease areas where the institutions can have greater agency in how they are sharing their data, what they're sharing, who they're sharing it with, and really sort of aligning the Enclave platform with those governance recommendations, with the access control mechanisms and security monitoring that are so terrific in the Foundry platform. So we do have Friday governance meetings where we discuss all of these things, and any number of different people have been attending in order to help contribute to what this new governance structure will look like. As this pilot phase comes to a close, we definitely want community feedback, whether you're in a project or not, whether you're at a site sharing data or not, everyone's welcome to provide contributions, feedback on, you know, where we've gotten to thus far. And so that's really an invitation to those Friday meetings. Secondly, as we just saw in the beautiful demo, there are a ton of reusable artifacts and collaboration opportunities that are being realized in the tenant. The logic liaison templates, code sets, and many other shared artifacts in the knowledge store really helped us expedite research and foster best practices. And we fundamentally, I think, have pivoted what in clinical informatics was a fairly siloed and competitive community in most contexts into something that is genuinely collaborative and building on each other's work. We basically incentivize people to share their artifacts because those artifacts then result in further publications and there's proper attribution managed. And so we want to continue along those lines. We also are promoting sharing across tenants and trying to figure out all the technical details for how to best do that and make sure that the attribution is retained. So that, for example, if someone wants to do maybe asthma in children, and they have some, code sets that might be relevant in an adult related project, that might be transferable to another tenant. So we're kind of thinking through some of those details and look forward to users' feedback on how well that's working and what kind of features everyone would like to see. And then finally, I wanted to talk just a little bit about how do we continue to enable quality research, and how do we foster this in the context of the tenant pilot. So one of the things that we learned kind of the hard way, I think, early on, and have really overcome, is really understanding where does the data come from. And really, because we have such terrific provenance on the data, this can really help understand when designing your analyses, how to best take that into account. And it's important to note that there's an extraordinary source variability, and that the data is harmonized but not homogeneous. And so, we need our methods to take these things into account. There's an enormous amount of effort that goes into assessing data quality and repairing data where possible. And so it's critically important when developing methods and analysis plans that these things are taken into account. Similarly, when you're designing an observational study and best practices, the specific kinds of things to do in the face of that source variability and harmonized but not homogeneous and data quality issues that we have, what's the best approaches for things like propensity matching, or which machine learning algorithms, or which risk models, or which time to event studies. We've learned a lot together, and we want to make sure that we advance those best practices in doing as high quality observational research as we can in these new tenant contexts. And then finally, as Ken had mentioned, we have an incredible amount of data linkage efforts that have gone on, as well as third-party data sets, as Saad showed in the demo. And we really want to foster the continued improvements and addition of new integrations that can help support the research that goes on in individual tenants. Next slide. So just a quick overview of the timeline. So we're just past that July 7th mark and have just started analyses with the 6 sites that we have data for, and we hope to have the rest of the data very soon. It's been very interesting to go through the process of getting all of the regulatory agreements signed and reviewed. And also just working through a lot of those governance issues. There was a lot of work done by Emily Paff and her team in writing the phenotype scripts and testing those at all the sites. And so our project milestone is really the end of August 31st ends the contract for completing the preliminary analyses on the tenant pilots. And so the next time we meet in September, we'll be able to show you the first scientific results from these tenant pilots. And we'd urge everyone, as Saad showed, to consider coming to the project team meetings or to the governance meetings to help us kind of finalize the report that will result from all of this with recommendations for how do we move forward in the future with any number of potential future tenants for different types of research. So that's the last thing I have. Oh, I have one more slide, I think. Thanks. So I just wanted to kind of remind folks about how impactful you've all been. So this was, if you go to our Google Scholar link, we now have over 200 papers and preprints with over 2,400 citations and an H-index of 24. And if you click forward, please. So our hope then is that we can do this together for all the different disease areas that people have that they're interested in. So when you think about that capacity and that opportunity and potential, it's really quite extraordinary. And so much of all of the work that we've done together is really ready-made for many, many different disease areas. And for those of you who know me, I'm super excited because I have some very specific rare disease study goals that I'm very interested in having a tenant for, hopefully when we're finished with the pilot. So I'm looking forward to everybody's feedback. I just wanted to say thanks so much. It's been quite the adventure to get us to this point, and looking forward to presenting the science results when we meet next in September. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for this excellent presentation. I think sometimes we forget like how far we've come. When I first taught maybe like 10 years ago, informatics, to undergraduate at Stony Brook, and we talked about electronic health records, and we said, what are the advantages of electronic health records? And we talked about improving science, and improving patient care. And, at that point, we were very far from having a system and having these tools in place. And now we're getting closer to the future, right? And then even if you look at where we were on January 1st, 2020, right? And all the work that, that we all started in March of 2020 with COVID, and all the hard work and many hours of everybody putting all these pieces together. And now we sort of start to see the future, right? Of being able to sort of work in a more interactive way with the data and collaborate groups in interesting ways. So it's very impressive.
Well, Dennis, thank you. I want to say that this is something I've been working on a long time, and I'm equally impressed with all the work people done. And, in CATS, there's a lot of things that we do, but I feel like our job is to give people the best tools and opportunity to do good science. And that's, even though we can talk about the endless minutia of the details, that's the goal. And so I just, thank everybody for, for the effort. It's been a lot of work, but it's really come a long way. So thank you.
We have one question in Q&A still, right? There's a response. Are there any questions? Okay.
It doesn't look like we have anything in chat or Q&A.
Okay. So I guess we'll reconvene in 2 weeks. And we'll get some good, real hands-on data design, and how do we utilize all this data that's brought together.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.